You see it every time you're stuck at the gate. A plane the size of a building lifts off like it weighs nothing. You've probably wondered, just for a second, what it would take to own one of those. Not just a plane, the whole operation. The tickets, the routes, the logo on the tail. It seems like the kind of dream reserved for billionaires with too much money and too much ego. But the real economics behind owning an airline are far more interesting than you think. Let's start with the myth. You imagine a single rich founder, a hangar, a dream, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. That's not how it works. Almost nobody builds an airline from a blank sheet of paper anymore. Instead, there are really 3 doors in. You can start a brand new low-cost carrier from scratch, chasing routes the big players ignore. You can buy into an existing airline, either a controlling stake or a full buyout, the way private equity firms have been doing for the last decade. Or you can go smaller. Charter operations, cargo airlines, regional feeder carriers that fly passengers from small towns into the hubs of giants like Delta or United. 3 doors. 3 completely different price tags. Which one would you even choose? Most people picture themselves as the founder of Virgin Atlantic, launching with charisma and a bit of theater. What they don't picture is the graveyard behind that image. For every Virgin or Ryanair that survived its first turbulent decade, there's a long list of paper airlines that announced routes, sold early tickets, and folded before a single plane ever left the runway. The barrier isn't creativity. Anyone can design a logo and pick a catchy name. The real barrier is capital, patience, and a tolerance for losing money for years before you're allowed to make any at all. Here's where the fantasy meets the spreadsheet. Starting a new airline from the ground up typically runs anywhere from $50 million to $200 million, and that's before you've sold a single ticket. A big chunk of that goes to aircraft. A new narrow-body jet, the kind you'd use for short domestic hops, can cost $30 to over $100 million each, depending on the manufacturer and the configuration. And you don't need one plane. You need a fleet, because a single aircraft grounded for maintenance with no backup can bankrupt a fragile new airline in a matter of weeks. Boeing and Airbus essentially split this entire global market between them, and neither one negotiates like a used car dealership. Lease instead of buy, and you dodge the upfront cost, but you trade it for monthly payments that never stop, rain or shine, empty seats or full ones. And that's just the metal. You also need somewhere to put it. Airports don't hand out gate space and takeoff slots for free, and at the busiest hubs in the world, they barely hand them out at all. At places like London Heathrow, usable slots are so scarce that airlines have historically paid tens of millions of dollars just for the right to land there twice a day, forever. It's less like renting space and more like buying a permanent piece of real estate that happens to be a 5-minute window on a runway schedule. Without it, your beautifully financed fleet has nowhere useful to fly. Then there's the invisible cost. Regulatory approval. In the United States, that means the Department of Transportation and the FAA, and the process alone can take a year or more before you're legally allowed to sell a single ticket. You need certified pilots, certified mechanics, a safety management system, insurance policies large enough to cover a worst-case scenario nobody wants to imagine. This is one of the most heavily regulated industries on the planet, and for good reason. Every corner cut on paperwork is a corner cut on the safety of a few hundred people at 35,000 feet. Even after certification, the maintenance bill never stops arriving. Every aircraft runs on a strict inspection schedule, and every few years it goes through what's called a heavy check, where the plane is essentially stripped down to its structure and rebuilt. A single heavy check can cost millions of dollars and take the aircraft out of service for weeks, all while it earns you nothing and the lease payments keep coming regardless. You're not just buying a plane. You're signing up for a decades-long relationship with a machine that demands attention, money, and downtime on a schedule you don't control. So you've got the planes. You've got the certification. Now here's the part that quietly destroys most new airlines, the profit margin. This is the number almost nobody talks about at parties. The global airline industry, across every carrier, every route, every country, runs on a net profit margin of somewhere between 2 and 4%. Read that again. Not 40%. Not even 15. 2 to 4. For every $100 a passenger spends on a ticket, the airline keeps somewhere around $4, sometimes less, after fuel, staff, maintenance, airport fees, and debt payments are all accounted for. Compare that to a coffee shop, which might run margins several times higher on a $5 latte. You are operating some of the most expensive machinery ever built by humans and pocketing pocket change per passenger. Why would anyone do this? Because volume changes everything. An airline like Southwest or Ryanair isn't trying to make a huge margin on any single seat. It's trying to fill every single seat, on every single flight, as many times a day as the plane can physically turn around. This is called load factor, and it's the single number airline executives obsess over more than almost anything else. A flight that's 80% full might be profitable. The same flight at 60% full might lose money. There's a razor's edge in between, and airlines live or die by which side of that edge they land on, flight after flight, all year long. This is exactly why the airline industry keeps consolidating into fewer, bigger players. It's incredibly difficult to survive alone on thin margins, so weaker carriers get absorbed by stronger ones almost every economic cycle. American Airlines merged with U.S. Airways. Delta absorbed Northwest. It's not really personal ambition driving these deals. It's survival math. A bigger airline can spread its fixed costs, its fuel contracts, and its maintenance operations across more flights, which quietly widens that razor-thin margin just enough to stay alive through the next downturn. And when a downturn hits hard enough, governments sometimes step in directly, propping up national carriers with loans or bailouts because a country without a functioning airline loses tourism, trade, and international standing almost overnight. Ownership here doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists at the mercy of an entire economic ecosystem you don't control. Now think about who you'd actually be dealing with once the planes are in the air. It's a longer chain than you'd expect. Airport authorities, who charge you landing fees and gate rental, sometimes by the minute. Air traffic control systems, funded by fees baked into every ticket. Fuel suppliers, whose prices swing with global oil markets you have zero control over. Labor unions representing pilots, flight attendants, and mechanics, each with their own contract negotiations that can ground your entire fleet if talks collapse. Aircraft leasing companies, if you didn't buy outright. Global distribution systems and booking platforms, who take a cut every time a travel agent or app sells your seat. You're not running one business. You're coordinating a dozen businesses that all need to be paid, on time, before the plane can even push back from the gate. There's another angle worth considering here, and it's the one most aspiring owners skip entirely: cargo. While passengers argue over legroom, the belly of that same aircraft is often hauling freight, and for some carriers, cargo revenue has quietly become the difference between a profitable year and a loss. During periods when passenger demand collapses, cargo can keep an airline breathing. It's a separate business riding inside the same fuselage, with its own contracts, its own customers, and often a far healthier margin than the seats above it. Ultra-low-cost carriers take a different route entirely. Instead of leaning on cargo, they strip the ticket down to almost nothing and then charge separately for everything else. The seat, the bag, the printed boarding pass, even a bottle of water. It sounds aggressive, but it's a deliberate strategy because unbundling the price lets them win on the headline fare while quietly rebuilding their margin through fees most passengers don't compare when they're shopping for flights. And then the challenges start showing up, usually all at once. Fuel is the classic villain. It can represent a quarter or more of an airline's total operating costs, and it moves independently of anything you do. A war on the other side of the planet can spike oil prices and erase your quarterly profit before you've even noticed. Weather grounds flights and stacks up cancellations that cost far more than the missed ticket revenue, because you're also paying for hotel vouchers, rebooking, and crew that are now out of position for tomorrow's schedule. Then there's the brutal reality of low switching costs. A passenger comparing your airline to a competitor is usually one browser tab away from choosing whoever's $12 cheaper. Loyalty programs exist specifically to fight this, turning frequent flyers into a captive audience through points and status tiers. And for some airlines, the loyalty program itself becomes more profitable than actually flying the planes. Here's the truth that flips the entire idea on its head. Many of the biggest airlines in the world barely make their money from flying passengers at all. Frequent flyer programs, credit card partnerships, and cargo divisions often generate profit margins many times higher than the passenger seats themselves. Delta and American have both, at various points, made more from selling miles to banks than from selling seats to travelers. The plane is essentially a marketing vehicle for a financial product. That's the counterintuitive twist most people never consider when they look up at a jet crossing the sky. You're not looking at a flying vehicle business. You're looking at a loyalty and finance business that happens to need wings to function. So if you were seriously considering any level of ownership here, even a small stake in a regional charter operation, the first practical thing to actually research is load factor and fuel hedging strategy for whichever airline or route you're evaluating. Because that single combination tells you more about survivability than almost any other metric on the balance sheet. It's publicly available for major airlines, and it's the difference between a business that grows slowly for decades and one that collapses in its second year, the way dozens of ambitious startup carriers already have. Owning an airline was never really about owning airplanes. It's about owning a razor-thin margin, a mountain of fixed costs, and a loyalty program clever enough to make the whole thing worth it. Next time you're stuck at the gate, watching that plane the size of a building lift off like it weighs nothing, you'll know exactly how much weight is actually sitting behind it.